Hello class, today we are looking at a paper by Louis Pojman, an essay by Louis Pojman on ethical relativism and the problems of ethical relativism. And so we have two versions of basically the same idea with slightly different titles. One is A Defense of Ethical Objectivism, and then another paper is Who's to Judge? But we're both, Louis Pojman is basically making the same conclusions. He's drawing the same conclusions in the two papers. So Louis Pojman is an American philosopher. He was born in 1935, and he taught at West Point, he's a philosophy professor. He taught at West Point in New York, and he was an author of several books and textbooks on ethics and philosophy. And so he opens with the point that although ethical relativism is a popularly held position, we usually don't understand what it entails, okay? Or we usually don't understand what it is that we are considering in depth. And so with moral relativism or ethical relativism. And so I also often hear such a misunderstanding from students with the notion that everyone is different. So in other words, I've heard this before in ethics class where when students are defining ethics, they often ascribe to a type of ethical relativism by pointing out this notion that everyone is different and we all have our own moral code, and so our morality then depends on the individual. And as soon as I say that, a lot of you also might recognize this argument. Everyone's different, so who's to say what is right or wrong? That kind of argument is rather popular and common. And so yet we ultimately, and also connected to this is that we ultimately only do best for ourselves as individuals, and etc. And so all of this is a type of ethical and moral relativism, and also verging into ethical egoism as well. But we're looking at ethical relativism. So Pojman in his essay seeks to dispel these uninvestigated, unexamined claims. So what we want to recognize first and foremost is that Pojman is an ethical objectivist, and he's calling into question and critiquing the problems of ethical relativism. So always know that he is not in favor of ethical relativism because he is an ethical objectivist. So he's criticizing the point of view of an ethical relativist here, okay? So to begin with, we have John Ladd's argument. So John Ladd was an ethical relativist who presents an argument, and this argument I will have featured on our homepage in the form of a PDF so that you could isolate the argument as well, okay, in writing. So the premise of the argument, one premise of the argument is, and that is one premise of John Ladd's argument in favor of ethical relativism is that one, moral rightness and wrongness of actions vary from society to society, so there are no universal moral standards held by all societies. Premise two, whether or not it is right for individuals to act in a certain way depends on or is relative to the society to which they belong. And three, the conclusion. Therefore, there are, according to John Ladd and the ethical relativist, no moral absolute or objective moral standards that apply to all people everywhere, okay? So this is John Ladd's argument in favor of ethical relativism. So then Pojman breaks this down according to the diversity thesis, and the dependency thesis of ethical relativism, which is slightly confusing given that each thesis is the diversity thesis and the dependency thesis are both the premises of John Ladd's argument, okay? So likewise, the whole argument is also an account of conventionalism, otherwise known as cultural relativism. So in other words, the first thesis of the diversity thesis is the premise of the argument. Moral rightness and wrongness vary or are different from society to society. So there are no universal standards held by all societies, okay? So that's the diversity thesis. And then so it's really the idea that because societies differ, there must not be an objective morality held between them. Then the second thesis is the second premise, and this is what he's referring to as the dependency thesis. Whether it's right or whether or not it is right for individuals to act in a certain way depends on or is relative to the society to which they belong. So whereby the relativist's claim is that morality or ethics depends on the society for which it derives, and in other words, the dependency there is the idea that the morality depends on the culture from which we are understanding that morality. And so I want you to notice that the key words here are diversity and dependency, and that the ethical relativist is either skeptical of the ethical objectivity held between differing societies and differing cultures, and that the morality simply depends on the difference. So I think one of the more difficult things to do is to show students that a definition of ethical relativism is not simply understood as societies are different, or that morality depends on culture. We have to show also that ethical relativism must be understood first and foremost as keeping these two premises and these two theses, yet it must also include the skepticism and or outright rejection of moral objectivity. So in other words, you're not just ascribing to this idea that cultures are different or that they are diverse, or that morality depends on the culture to which you're deriving the morality. You're looking also in conjunction with that, then a conclusion that the relativist is then calling into question or is skeptical or outright rejecting objectivity. Okay, so the classic form of ethical relativism as Pojman defines it is, quote, if there are different moral principles from culture to culture, and if all morality is rooted in culture, then it follows that there are no universal moral principles that are valid or true for all cultures and people at all times, unquote. So that's basically an argument also for an ethical relativist or a moral relativist. Okay, so now Pojman moves to what we call subjectivism. And so this is a more individualized form of cultural relativism, otherwise known to Pojman as conventionalism. So it's different than cultural relativism. And so here, Pojman quotes the oft-repeated, morality is in the eye of the beholder, which is only half of the definition of relativism. And Pojman offers a quote from the infamous serial murderer Ted Bundy, recounting a type of relativism whereby if relativism is true, then he should be allowed to do whatever he wants as a serial murderer. And this is a type of freedom, and hence relativism also becomes a defensive strategy, but also a way to ostensibly excuse immoral behavior as well. And so if all morality is relative to individuals, and there is no objective moral standard held between individuals, then the relativist should be allowed immorality with no impunity. In other words, with no justice. So, in other words, such a misguided view is held with the notion that that since we are all different and there's no moral grounding that is objective, then this is a problem, right? Then therefore we should be allowed to do whatever we want, right? And that is simply not true objectively. And so such a view is not only contradictory, in other words, if there are no moral objective standards, then I cannot judge anyone else's morality. And this is simply not true, because we do judge other people's morality, especially if they're serial murderers, etc. And so Pojman then moves to conventionalism. Conventionalism is otherwise known as cultural relativism, which has strong anthropological connections as well, with such anthropologists as Ruth Benedict and Melville Herskovits. So they have an argument that we could lay out in an argument formulation whereby we have the first premise: one, if morality is relative to culture, then there is no independent basis for criticizing the morality of any other culture but one's own, okay? And then the second premise is, if there is no independent way of criticizing any other culture, we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. And then a third premise: morality is then relative to culture, and really that's also a conclusion, but then we draw further to a conclusion: therefore we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. So yet, and this is Melville Herskovits and Ruth Benedict's argument for ethical relativism or cultural relativism in the name of tolerance. And so yet, as we closely look at Herskovits's argument, we see that morality is relative. So then, if we think that morality is relative, we should then be tolerant of any culture. But yet, why is it that tolerance should be upheld if this tolerance does not if the tolerance does not fall outside of morality, then we're good. But then if there are problems in terms of morality, then this call to tolerance then should be called into question, okay? So in other words, we are not tolerant of all cultures in spite of their immorality. In other words, if cultures are immoral, we are not just simply tolerant of them because they're different, okay? So in other words, if we are not tolerant of other cultures, then tolerance itself is also an objective moral standard that is somehow exempt from the relativist according to the argument. In other words, if you're insisting that we should be tolerant of all cultures in spite of their differences, there's the problem of morality. In other words, we're not going to tolerate cultures if they're immoral. But then also, if you're saying that we need to be tolerant of all cultures because of their difference, you're then imposing an objective strategy there, that we should be tolerant of all cultures in spite of their differences, and that's an objective standard. So the relativist is not aware of this logical inconsistency. So therefore, it's contradictory. So with Pojman's critique of ethical relativism, we go back to Ladd's ethical relativism argument that is an encapsulation of the diversity and dependency premises, whereby mere diversity and or difference does not nullify the ethical objectivity. So we still have objective moral standards that hold in spite of our differences. So another way of considering the perspective of ethical relativism is that the relativist sees moral and ethical differences between individuals and between cultures and automatically assumes that these differences are all there is, and that this is somehow too judgmental if we conclude that there are universal standards of morality that are held above and beyond these differences. But we have to remember that what the relativist is ignoring are the similarities, and likewise the objective similarities that are at issue when we're looking at problems of morality. Okay. So we often think that we're being polite and tolerant to ascribe to ethical relativism, yet we know that such tolerance quickly breaks down once we account for the immorality or breach of rules, breach of conduct, common code of conduct, etc., etc. Even slight rudeness of character is a problem for us in everyday cases. And this is enough to call our attention to the problem of tolerance and to see that as problematic. So the relativist imagines that if there were exceptions to the rules, then there are no codes of conduct or no objective ethics or no objective morality, and then to throw out objective morality or to call it into question. So although Pojman is clear to point out that moral objectivity is not to be confused with moral absolutism, whereby there is absolutely no exception to the rules, he is clear that what we have is something a little more realistic in terms of moral objectivity. Okay, so in other words, Pojman presents a short list of such objective principles as do not kill innocent people, or do not cause unnecessary pain or suffering, or do not cheat, lie, or steal, right? These are basic principles, and there's a lot more when you really start thinking about it that we objectively observe, but that the relativist isn't paying attention to. So they see differences between cultures and individuals and think that these differences constitute a rejection of moral objectivity altogether. And so Pojman's final argument that stands as a refutation, his refutation of ethical relativism, is worded as such. First premise being, quote, objectively valid moral principles are those in adherence to and which meet the needs and promote the most significant interests of persons, unquote. And so premise 2 is that some principles are such that in adherence to them meets the needs and promotes the most significant interests of people. So we're forgiving his personifications there, but we get the point. And then so 3, the conclusion, therefore there are some objectively valid moral principles. And so what I want you to note there is that he does emphasize most and also some. So in other words, he's not being a moral absolutist to insist that everyone needs to follow all the rules all of the time. He's thinking most people follow some of the rules most of the time, and therefore that's what we look at as moral objectivity, as opposed to insisting on all cases for everyone. And really what I tell students there is that the moral relativist really is a moral absolutist in disguise, because they think that there should be adherence to all rules for everyone, and if there's not, then we chuck out all moral objectivity. So overall, Pojman appeals to human nature as a way that we tend toward ethical objectivity, and likewise the way in which we tend toward the good, not only for ourselves, but also for others as well, including sentient and non-sentient beings, and also our environment. That are objective principles that we are in adherence to in our daily lives, according to Pojman. So thank you, and we'll talk more about this in class, and see you later.